Welcome back to the online event From Mourning to Light. Our next expert speaker is Mike Bernhardt, and Mike has a book called Voices of the Grieving Heart. It's an anthology of poetry and short essays that he has edited, and there's about 80 contributors to this book. Mike also facilitates a workshop called Expressing the Inexpressible, Writing Poetry for Our Grief. And Mike is very much into writing poetry, and I'm very interested to hear how it all started. So Mike, can you get us back to the beginning? What happened and how did you come to put this book together?
Sure. And thanks for spending time with me today. So my first wife, Susan, died in 1991. She was 31 and I was 34. And she had a congenital heart condition that we knew about, but we didn't expect it to end her life too early. And then things went south, as they say, and she basically died overnight. I mean, from a Saturday night to a Sunday morning, we went from taking her to the hospital to her dying the following morning. And so, you know, what can one say? I was devastated, of course, and struggled for quite a long time. But one of the ways that I dealt with it, I journaled a lot. I was going to a weekly drop-in support group. I was seeing a therapist. I was doing all of the right things, but I also journaled, and then I found myself wanting to write poems. And what I found in starting to do that was that poetry kind of had a different quality to it than journaling. And I've learned a lot since about what that difference in quality is. But at the time, I just knew that it was a way to bring my emotions and experiences out of me so that I could look at them in a different way than journaling does. When my experience was journaling was kind of like I'm explaining things to myself. Mm-hmm. And poetry was more like going deeper, expressing the emotions and the images that may not have, it may be hard to find words sometimes, but somehow with poetry and trying to express images that would come to mind, like a dead tree or something like that, it could bring out those feelings in a very different way. And then there was a point when I started wanting to find other people's poetry because it had been so valuable for me to read my own and write it. And I wanted to see what other people had done, and I couldn't find anything. So I put some ads in some newsletters, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Center newsletter and the Unitarian Universalist Church, Compassionate Friends, which is an organization that supports people who've lost children or siblings. And I put ads asking for submissions of poetry that people had written about their own losses. And what I'd said was that I was less interested in literary quality than I was in how well the author was able to express the feelings that they'd had. And I received, that was the first edition of this book. That was in 1992. And I received about 200 poems.
Wow.
From dozens and dozens of people.
That's a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
I had no idea that I was going to receive that much. And I decided to make a book out of the ones that meant the most to me. So I ended up with a book of 65 poems by 45 people. One of the people was me. And I turned that into a book. And then in September of 2020, when the pandemic was raging at its worst, I think, my current wife, we've been married now for decades, but she suggested that I really needed to republish this book because there was so much grief out there. And so I put out another call for submissions through a friend of mine who had a poetic medicine organization, and he had a mailing list.
Mm-hmm.
And I received another couple of hundred poems from more contributors. And so I took the ones that meant the most to me from that and created a new book. And so the current book has 80 contributors and 150 poems and short essays. So that's
And
how I
and
ended up there.
you've edited them as well a little bit. Oh, there it is. Beautiful. And you're also an editor, Mike. So can you
I
tell us a
am an
little bit
editor.
about how you edited their work?
Yeah, I mean, I did the most editing on the first book. I didn't edit at all, actually. The one back in 1992, I just collected the poems that they'd sent me, and that was it.
Mm,
Um, the second time around, there were two different things that I edited. One was some people's poems, they weren't so sure about them.
mm,
And so I just kind of looked at them. I do a lot of other writing these days,
mm,
and some editing on other people's essays, mostly travel related and other topics. But so I have a little more experience with editing, and I would make suggestions to them. Well, what if you said it this way, or if you switch these two verses, or um, one person in the book. I just thought I thought the last verse could be different, and so he wrote a new one, and I ended up taking two lines from the original one and two lines from the second one and put them together, and he loved it. And the main thing was that they had to be happy with it. It wasn't about me editing their poetry to be perfect.
mm,
Um, and if they wanted something to stay the way it was, then that's how it was going to be, because it was their grief and their expression of it.
mm,
I was just trying to help smooth things where they felt unsure.
mm,
So that was the first way that I did editing. The second was, there's a chapter in this book called Time Passes.
mhm,
And what I did was I went back to the original contributors from the 1993 book. And I asked them some questions like, what is your grief like for you now for that loss? What did you
Wow.
wish you knew then that you know now?
Wow.
What did you find meaning in the changes that you've made in your life, and what changed for you since in all of these years since?
Mm,
um, and I don't know of anyone else who's gone back and talked to people who lost a loved one decades ago and asked them, how is it for you now?
mm,
And so the answers for me were very surprising sometimes and very
mhm,
beautiful. And so what I did was, they sent me answers to their questions, and then I edited those into essays and then sent it back to them to make sure that what I said was accurate, um, and then made whatever changes they wanted. And then so the answers to their questions ended up as these short essays that are in the book. And there's
wow.
17 people who responded to that question, to that series of questions.
Mm,
So I think it's really unique to
mm,
have that. And some of them sent me poems that they'd written more recently
mm.
about other losses or about the same loss. Uh,
Wow, that must be so interesting to read. I think I want to buy the book just for that. And then let's talk about you then. So all these years later, you were married, and then how did you meet your current wife, and what was that like?
you know, I met my second wife only a few months after Susan died, but
Mm-hmm.
we were friends for quite some time. She wasn't interested in a relationship, and I certainly wasn't ready or interested in a relationship.
Mm,
Um, but I liked her, and so we just were friends. We'd go hiking together and do things like that. Um, but there was a point when I was thinking about being in a relationship again, but I wasn't sure. And how was I going to know that someone was the right one? And I was in a support group, the drop-in group that I said I'd been attending. And a woman came in, and I was acquainted with her actually, but I hadn't seen her in years. And I was acquainted with her outside of the group. And she had remarried. Her first husband had died. And then she'd been married a couple of years. And I asked her, how did you know that it was time? And she said, I knew that he was the right one when I could cry in his arms for my first husband.
Mm.
And I said, I hope I can find somebody like that. And she said, you will. You won't settle for anything less. And that was exactly my experience. When I could cry in Ivana's the name of my second wife, when I could cry in her arms over Susan, that was the day that I knew she was the one. So she had space to love me, and she had space for me to love both of them. So that's how that happened.
That's a beautiful story, Mike. And that's a great indicator for someone who isn't sure about whether they want to commit to a new person or not. So thank you for sharing that very, very intimate insight. Thank you.
You're welcome. I will add also that it was difficult for her, you know, because there were times when I had to cancel a dinner or something that we were going to do together because I just needed to grieve. So, I give her enormous credit for not leaving. And I know that there were times when she questioned it, but she never let me know that. So.
But at least you were authentic that you were in grief, and you didn't put on a brave face and pretend everything was okay and went on a date with her.
No, the only way it could work for me was to just be honest about how I was feeling. And if she couldn't, and that was really what that story was about, is that if she couldn't handle that in some way, she clearly either wasn't the right time or she wasn't the right person. So I had to be true to myself.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, Mike. And I think that's great advice for people watching. They can just look at their own lives in relation to what you've just shared and make their own decisions. And also to know that it's okay to meet someone else, and it's okay, and still be grieving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I learned from, I knew it from my own experience, but one of the things that I learned from those answers to questions that I received was that the guilt is normal. And I think the trick is just, I don't know if it's a trick, but as I said, you just have to tell yourself the truth. And the biggest fear that I had was that I was going to forget Susan, and that if I stopped hurting, I would forget her. Or if I loved someone else, I would forget her. And what I've learned since is that I've never forgotten her. And I'm here right now because of her. So it's not about, so many changes. I can look back and see so many changes in my life that were not just because she died, but because I loved her. And
that's
so if anyone's afraid that they'll forget, they won't.
That's fantastic, Mike. Wow. Okay, so if someone's interested in finding out more about the book and the poetry, where can they go, Mike?
Well, they can go to my website, which is mikebernhardt.net, MikeBernhardt.net. And there's a page there where they can order the book, not direct from me. I've got links to Amazon. I've got links to the Independent Bookstore Association. If they want to buy it from their local bookstore, they can order it direct from their local bookstore if they prefer. It's available to any bookstore. And yeah, there's other things that are on that my website. There's, if they go to mikebernhardt.net/poems, 15 of the contributors have read their own poems on video that are in the book. And so you can get a taste of the book by watching the authors read their own poems.
Mm. I've had a look at that, Mike. It is so beautiful. Some of those poems are so touching.
Well, thanks.
And say someone is interested in writing poetry to help them with their grief. You host that workshop. How would they find out about the next one?
So there's an organization that's San Francisco based, but it's online, called Let's Reimagine. They're called Reimagine, and the website is letsreimagine.org. And they can look there. I've been doing this workshop called Expressing the Inexpressible, Poetry for Grief. I'm doing it once in a while through them, and you get the choice of doing it for free or paying $15 if you'd like to support the host of the workshop, which is me, but it's your choice. And you can go on the letsreimagine.org website and just look for it. If you look for Expressing the Inexpressible, if it's on their calendar, it'll be there. And there's a link there to register, and just come. And what I do in that is I talk about poetry and grief, and we do a couple of writing exercises to sort of help people get into the right frame of mind and to let go of their fears about writing. It's no poetry experience is required.
Mm-hmm.
And we share what we wrote. It's a very intimate space.
Mm.
And so people will share what they've written. And I've gotten really good feedback about it.
Sounds great, Mike. And just tell us a little bit, how does writing poetry help people in grief? Like, what are the things that you've seen?
Well, I'll give you an example. There's a couple of things that I can talk about. One thing is I'm going to give you an example of a journal entry that I wrote about a month after Susan died, and then a poem that was about the same experience that I wrote. Okay. So in my journal, I wrote, Susan died exactly 1 month ago. Maybe that's why it's so hard for me today. I miss her so much. I would give anything to have her back. Nothing else matters, really. I would give anything to have her back. And then I wrote this poem called Scream at the Ocean. And this is on page 40 in my book. The ocean waves pile up on one another, rolling forward relentlessly, smashing onto the beach. And eyes wide open, powerful in rage, I scream with all my might. But the surf drowns my voice. I cannot bring her back. And so there are two very different ways of talking about the same experience. But the poem, when I read it now, I still remember what that felt like, that sense of powerlessness that I had, much more so than just reading, oh yeah, I missed her, 31 years ago. And what I found is that reading other people's poetry can have the same experience when you read a poem that reflects your experience, and those images can kind of cut through the, well, they're older, they're younger, they're different, it was a man, not a woman, whatever it is. I'm straight, I'm gay, it doesn't, none of those things matter because the experience is the same. And so you read a poem, I would imagine, I've never asked, but someone else who's feeling very powerless about their spouse or partner dying, or even a child dying, could read that poem and say, I know just how that feels. So there's a quality of reflection and mirroring that happens where you can read a poem and you see yourself in it.
I would go so far as to say that poetry is your soul language, because when you were reading that poem, that happened to me exactly. It put me straight back to the beach when I was screaming at the waves. I mean, I was right back there, and I remember it clearly. So I think it's your language of your soul, Mike. I don't know. That's
Yeah,
how I would describe it. Yeah.
I think so. Somebody more scientific would say that you're accessing the right side of the brain with poetry, even though you're using language, which is a more left-brained activity. But you're accessing the creative side, the nonverbal side, which is where I think so much of grief lies, in the emotions and the images and the fears and the trauma and the memories and all of that stuff. And that's why I called my workshop Expressing the Inexpressible, because it can be so hard to find words for that. And you might even write in a journal, I just don't have any words for this. But somehow in the poetry, you can find the words because you're describing the images.
That is so true, because I think February, March, April, about 2 or 3 months after my husband died, my friend gave me a sparkly journal and a sparkly pen for my birthday. And she encouraged me to journal, to write. And you know what, Mike? I couldn't. I just couldn't. My brain fog was really, really severe. And
Yeah,
I found writing poetry, I could do that. So that's what I did. Out of
exactly.
pure not being able to do anything else, I just wrote poetry. Maybe I should send some to you.
I'd love to read it.
Uh-huh.
So, and the other thing I think is what I encourage people to do in that workshop, is just you're not writing poetry for me or for anyone else. You're writing poetry for yourself. And so I really encourage people who, in general, if people want to try writing poetry, it's only for you. Don't worry about how good it is or how good you think it is. It all that matters is that you're saying what you need to say, and that when you read it, if you can feel your own truth in it, that's the most important thing.
I like
And I
that
found
word,
with
truth.
practice, it came out more as well. So
Yeah, yeah. And the more you do it, the easier it gets.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It starts to become a mode that you just automatically go to when you're feeling something.
When I first came to Italy, I would take my sparkly journal and my sparkly pen, and I would go up to the little cafe in the piazza, and I would order a cappuccino, because I didn't know many people here and I couldn't speak Italian then. And I would just sit and it would come to me. I would describe where I was, how I was feeling. And the more I did it, the more expressive it became. It became addictive, actually. I looked forward to going to the piazza to go and write.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. Last fall, I had an experience. I wrote a lot of poetry, obviously, about my own grief. I wrote a poem. I experienced a lot of trauma because of the suddenness of Susan's death. And it was something I struggled with for months. And I would truly have to hang on to the countertop in the kitchen because I felt dizzy. That kind of, it was very much like PTSD. And it would come on me unexpectedly. And after I'd been writing poetry for a few months, I was driving in my car and I started to feel that wave of dizziness and trauma again. But I was going, 50 miles an hour or something, 80 kilometers. And obviously it was not the time for that. And I just told myself, because I'd had some practice writing by then, I told myself, I need to put this aside. But as soon as I get home, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write about this experience. And I did that. And I got home and I sat down and I closed my eyes and I dropped into that shock experience that I was having.
Mm.
And I wrote a poem about the night that she died, or the morning that she died. And I can read it for you if you'd like.
I'd love you to, Mike. Yes, please.
So, and then later I'll read another poem that was sort of, I look at it as sort of a bookend, because I wrote it much later about being with Yvonne.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I've just got to find a poem here.
So many poems, so little time.
Yeah, here they are. It's called Sunday.
Okay.
Together, we survived the terrifying night of CPR and defibrillation. Too many tubes and wires and doctors. My kisses on your forehead and your eyes kissing me back. Until your EKG exploded and they told me to leave. I sat outside in the hallway, talking softly to you. In the morning, though your eyes seemed empty, I expected your recovery and went home to sleep, only to be greeted by a ringing phone and an urgent voice. And I was out again, stuck in traffic on the Bay Bridge, praying, screaming at God to get me to you in time. Hoping that curses and prayers might be enough, I inched and fought my way through traffic and despair until finally free, nearly drowning, I plunged into the streets, racing to San Francisco General. Sometimes now I like to imagine what I would have told the police if they'd noticed. I like to think I wouldn't have pulled over. I would have just plummeted on at 70 miles an hour up Potrero Avenue, letting them catch up to me in the parking lot as I ran inside. My wife's dying, I would have screamed. But they didn't notice. I ran inside alone to find my friends crying and you dead.
Mm.
And the interesting thing was when I got that poem out of me, I never had that experience of shock again.
Wow.
So I'm not going to say that writing poetry will heal your trauma, but it healed mine. So
But if it doesn't heal it, it will help. It sounds like
it will help. I think
will help.
Even if the experience had continued to happen in some form, I think for me, getting that poem out, getting all of that fear and pain that was stuck inside of me out where I could look at, this is what happened, this is how I felt, was incredibly healing for me. So
That's an incredibly powerful poem, Mike.
yeah, I mean, this book is full of those.
And now looking back, what was the poem you wrote?
There's a poem I have in here called Time Passes. And I wrote this a few years later. Bright red dragonfly hovers by my face, slips off and returns again and again. Cat watches with vague interest from his shaded lair under the patio table. Yvonne tends the flowers, picks a zucchini and strawberries for dinner. Life continues now, as if you had never been here, though I am here because of you. Your death connected me forever to what lies beyond this world. I felt that light inside me always. Rudderless, beguiled, I longed to join it. But time passes. Yvonne is smiling at me. We talk of dreams and having children. This garden is exploding with life, and I'm no longer in any hurry to leave.
Wow. That is incredible, Mike.
I feel like they're bookends of my grief experience,
Beautiful.
Thanks.
Before we close, is there any last words or any words of wisdom you have for the audience?
Words of wisdom. I think I would just say, trust yourself. Trust your grief. You know, people say, when am I going to get over this? And David Kessler's answer is, how long do you expect to live? It's a grief.
It's a good answer.
Yeah. You will always have your grief, but it changes. You know, it at first it feels like a really steep mountain that you'll never get over, and it's so hard. Every day is just painful and difficult, and you don't know if you can go on. But eventually it kind of levels out and you find yourself in a different place. And it gets easier. Eventually, whether we want it to or not, our life continues. And at first we maybe don't want it to, but there will be a point when we start to see light again, and changes happen, but it doesn't mean that we'll forget the person we love. They'll always be there. So that's my advice.
That's beautiful, Mike. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for your time, Mike, and for sharing those beautiful poems with us. And to all of you watching, keep a lookout in your inboxes for the next exciting episode in From Mourning to Light 2. Thank you for joining us.